Hey everybody, Frank with EMI here, and today I'd like to demonstrate how I service my rack and pinion. Oftentimes when I talk to customers who are experiencing steering issues, the first question I tend to ask is, when was the last time you've serviced your rack and pinion? A lot of times that's never. So today we're gonna take my rack and pinion apart and show you how I service it. Okay, so first things first is we gotta get the rack and pinion out of the race car. So I typically disconnect the drag link from the unit first, so we'll get that off there. That's good. Okay. Then we need to disconnect the U-joint from the back side and pull the main bolts out of the frame. We got to get this jam nut off the set screw first, so we'll break that loose. And it doesn't matter, you can just go a little bit because the set screw is what really matters. So we'll get that out next. I just typically pull my set screw all the way out. And then once I get this baby free, all that's left is the main bolts for the frame. Okay, so now the rack and pinion is free and we got it out. I'm gonna get these bolts out here real quick. So the one thing I think is important for people to understand is, and why it's so critical that we clean this thing and service it regularly, is because the unit's not sealed, right? So all the gears inside, they're greased, they're lubricated, and without the unit being sealed, we're gonna get dirt, grime, grit. It's all gonna go into the steering unit. So if we don't take it apart and clean it and service it, oftentimes you'll get buildup on both ends, and that's why you lose your left to right steering. You lose some throw there. So all we have here for people who've never done this before is the housing is just two halves, and it's held together by two set screws and some dowel pins. So let's split this thing open and see what it looks like inside. Now I'm going to show you one of my little tricks, because sometimes these halves are hard to split even once you get the screws out, right? So you can see you're split open a little bit. But what I like to do is take a plastic hammer. I keep the bolts somewhat threaded in, but I just tap it with the hammer right on the bolt, and it usually pops it free from the dowel pin. Then we can pull the screws the rest of the way apart. And open the unit up. So as you can see, you've got just a rack and a pinion gear, and that's all this steering is. So yeah, usually what I do is I just take the time to get the housing and the gears cleaned up so they're free of grease, grit, grime, dirt, and then we'll put it back together. So typically when I clean this, I use a parts washer. If you don't have a parts washer, that's okay. Some rags and some brake cleaner or some type of mineral spirits that's good with cutting through grease is just fine. The important thing is that we just get everything wiped clean out of the housing and off the gears. That way they're fresh, free of grit, and before we put it back together. Okay, so once we got this thing good and clean, right? I just typically manually grease everything back up by hand. What I like to use is a white lithium grease just because it's lightweight, it's slick, the gears can slide through it quite easily. So I put a light film on the inside of the housing, and then we'll grease up the gears as well. I like to get a little bit between the teeth that I know are going to be engaged with the rack. And you don't need to overdo it. Like I said, just a light film, because that's going to create excessive drag, which you don't need in the steering. Okay, so once you got your gears and your housing greased up a little bit, just slide the two halves back together. You press it on good so the dowel pins are seated. Wipe down any excess grease that might have got all over. I tend to be messy. And we'll just put our screws back in here. Now, like I said before, this is something that you should make a habit of doing regularly. Like I say, my routine is about every third race I take these apart. I clean them up really good, re-grease them, put them back together. I tend to avoid pumping grease in through the grease circ. As you can see, our housing doesn't even have a grease circ for that reason. I like to do it manually. That way I know that everything on the inside gets cleaned out well. We're not getting any excessive dirt buildup. You know, if you go too long, like I say, you're gonna get that dirt buildup on both ends of the housing, which is gonna reduce the ability to steer. We also wanna make sure we get that grit cleaned out just because it's abrasive, right? So it's, even though those gears in there are very hard, they can still wear easier if you've got abrasives in there. So now all we have left to do is put it back on the car. As we slide it on, just make sure we get our U-joint lined up as we push it in. So I typically tighten up the unit to the frame before I hook anything else back up. That way you know it's on there solid. And the other thing too is you don't have to get this overly tight on the frame, because if you get it too tight, you can squeeze the housing into the gears, which can create a bind. So just maybe a little more than snug is plenty. It's not gonna fall off. So all that's left now is to jam the U-joint, which we'll do now. Make sure we get our set screw tight first before we tighten the jam nut. And last but not least, we'll reconnect the drag link and we're done. Hopefully this has been helpful to those who may have been trying to figure out some of their steering issues, or for those who are looking to expand on some of their maintenance procedures. As always, if you have any questions, you can call us at EMI or Speedway Motors, and I hope everybody has a great day.